The golden chandeliers of the Hathaway and Company auction house gleamed overhead, casting a warm light over the meticulously polished marble floors. Camille Johnson stood near the entrance, her dark eyes calmly scanning the crowd of the elite who bustled around, sipping champagne and exchanging pleasantries. She adjusted her tailored black coat, her demeanor composed yet unassuming. Camille had no intention of mingling. Her sole focus was the reason she was here, the masterpiece, the Golden Muse. "Excuse me," she said softly to the receptionist behind the ornately carved desk. The woman barely glanced up, her perfectly styled blonde hair falling over one shoulder. "Yes, I'd like to register for the auction." Camille slid her invitation across the desk, her movements deliberate but polite. The receptionist's manicured fingers hesitated on the edge of the card. Her blue eyes flicked up, scanning Camille's appearance. She saw a woman of striking elegance, yet without the familiar designer labels or ostentatious jewelry that usually adorn Hathaway and Company's clientele. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the receptionist said after a beat, a practiced smile curling her lips. "This is a private event." Camille blinked, her expression unmoving. "I was invited." "The name's Camille Johnson." The receptionist tapped her keyboard briskly, a skeptical edge in her movements. "I don't see you on the list." Camille's jaw tightened imperceptibly. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Check again. Perhaps under C, Johnson?" The woman huffed, her fingers clicking against the keys. The pause stretched, tension simmering beneath the murmur of the surrounding conversations. After a few moments, the receptionist straightened, her expression cool. "I still don't see anything. Are you sure you're at the right event?" Camille exhaled slowly, holding back the sharp retort that rose in her throat. "I assure you, I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." Behind her, the low sound of laughter drifted through the room. Two men in tailored suits whispered to one another, their eyes darting in Camille's direction. She caught the faint snicker of one. "Lost, maybe?" Camille turned slightly, her gaze locking with theirs. The weight of her unflinching stare silenced them, their smug expressions faltering for a moment before they turned away. Another staff member approached the desk, his name tag reading Andrew. He leaned close to the receptionist. "Is there an issue here?" he asked, glancing briefly at Camille. "She's trying to register, but she's not on the list," the receptionist said dismissively. Camille squared her shoulders. "I have the funds to participate. You can verify that with your financial team." Andrew hesitated, his eyes flickering with doubt. "It's not just about funds. Hathaway and Company prides itself on maintaining a certain standard of clientele." The implication hung heavy in the air, unspoken but clear. Camille's lips tightened into a thin line. "Your standards," she said evenly, "should be based on the art and the passion for preserving it, not on appearances or assumptions." Andrew's polite smile was tinged with condescension. "I'm afraid there's nothing more we can do. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of our public exhibitions." The words stung, but Camille refused to let her composure falter. She stepped back, taking the invitation from the desk without another word. As she walked toward the exit, a voice stopped her. "Ms. Johnson?" She turned to see a young man in a well-fitted suit, holding a clipboard. His badge read Oliver, assistant curator. He approached her with a look of uncertainty. "I believe we've corresponded before," he said, glancing at her invitation. "You're interested in the Golden Muse?" "Yes," Camille said, her voice calm but firm. "But your colleagues seem determined to bar my entry." Oliver's cheeks reddened as he glanced at the receptionist, who avoided his gaze. "That's a mistake. Let me see if I can—" Before he could finish, Andrew interjected. "Oliver, we have procedures for a reason. Let's not waste time." "Waste time?" Oliver frowned. "This is Camille Johnson. Her name is—" "Unfamiliar," Andrew cut in smoothly. "And irrelevant if she doesn't meet our criteria." Camille held up a hand, silencing Oliver's protests. Her voice was steady, laced with a quiet authority. "It's fine. I'm used to being underestimated." She turned to Oliver, a hint of warmth softening her tone. "Thank you for trying." As she exited the building, her heels clicking against the marble, the cold November air bit at her face. She paused on the steps, looking back briefly at the glowing windows of the auction house. Behind those panes of glass, she could hear the faint hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the ease with which others were accepted into that world. Camille's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a message from her closest confidant and curator of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, David Green. "Did you secure your spot?" Camille typed back, "Not yet. I'll handle it." David's reply was almost immediate. "What happened?" Camille hesitated for a moment before responding. "Nothing new. They assumed I didn't belong." David's response came swiftly. "Their mistake. Let me know if you need me to step in." Camille stared at the glowing screen for a moment, then slipped the phone back into her pocket. She didn't need David's help. Not yet. For now, she would let them believe she was inconsequential. But the fire simmering in her chest reminded her of what she had learned long ago. Underestimation could be a powerful weapon. As the wind whipped around her, Camille smiled faintly to herself. The golden muse would be hers. The only question was how. Camille sat in her car, her fingers drumming lightly on the steering wheel as the city lights blurred through the windshield. The echoes of the auction house's dismissal lingered in her mind, each word a sharpened reminder of the barriers she had navigated her entire life. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a call. She sighed, glancing at the screen. David's name flashed across it. "David," she said, answering reluctantly. "I just heard back from a contact at Hathaway," David began, his tone brimming with restrained fury. "They told me you weren't on the list." "Camille, you're the list." "I know," she said simply. "No, you don't know." David's voice grew louder. "Do you have any idea how absurd it is for the world's foremost collector to be treated like some random person off the street?" "I have every idea," she replied, her calmness unnerving even to herself. David sighed deeply, the frustration evident. "Let me call them. I'll clear this up." "No, Camille." "I said no, David." She leaned back in her seat, her voice firm but measured. "If I let you intervene, I'm just reinforcing their belief that I can't stand on my own. That's not how I operate." There was silence on the other end. Finally, David spoke, his tone softer. "So what's the plan?" She smiled faintly, staring at the glowing skyline. "The plan is to remind them who they're dealing with, but in my own way." Before David could argue further, Camille ended the call. She sat quietly for a moment, letting the tension settle. The next morning, she arrived back at Hathaway and Company, this time dressed with deliberate precision. A custom gray suit tailored to perfection, a silk scarf tied loosely around her neck, and a vintage Cartier brooch pinned to her lapel. Everything about her appearance exuded power and understated wealth. The receptionist from the previous day was still stationed behind the desk. Her face faltered slightly as she recognized Camille, but she quickly masked it with her usual professional veneer. "Good morning," Camille said smoothly, setting her handbag on the counter. The receptionist hesitated. "Can I help you?" "Yes. I'd like to speak with the director of the auction, please. It's a matter of importance." The receptionist hesitated again, her eyes darting toward a nearby security guard. "I'm not sure if—" Before she could finish, a familiar voice interrupted. "Ms. Johnson, what a surprise to see you back." Andrew appeared from a side hallway, his hands clasped behind his back. His smile was polite but distinctly disingenuous. "Mr. Andrew," Camille said, turning to face him. "It seems I left without properly introducing myself yesterday." Andrew tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "You certainly made an impression, Ms. Johnson. I intend to make another one today," she said, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "May we speak in private?" Andrew gestured toward a nearby sitting room, his smile tightening. "Of course." As they entered the room, Camille noted the luxurious decor. The antique Persian rug, the gold-framed mirrors, the velvet chairs arranged just so. It was a space designed to impress. She took a seat without waiting for an invitation, crossing her legs gracefully. Andrew remained standing, his posture stiff. "So, Ms. Johnson, what can I do for you?" "You can start," Camille said, "by explaining why I was barred entry yesterday, despite presenting a valid invitation." Andrew's smile wavered. "As I explained before, our events are curated for a specific clientele. A clientele that doesn't include me, she interrupted, her tone razor-sharp. Andrew hesitated, the silence between them growing heavy. "You didn't even check my credentials," she continued. "You made an assumption based on how I looked. Don't deny it." Andrew cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Ms. Johnson, our policies are not personal. They're about maintaining the integrity of our events." "Integrity?" Camille's eyebrow arched, and her voice dropped, carrying an almost lethal calm. "Do you even know who I am?" Andrew's face reddened slightly, but he held his composure. "I'm sure you're a respected collector, Ms. Johnson, but Hathaway and Company has a reputation to uphold." "Respected?" Camille leaned forward, her gaze cutting through him. "Let me educate you, Mr. Andrew. I own one of the most significant private art collections in the world. My acquisitions include works by Basquiat, Picasso, and Rembrandt. Names your house likely survives on. And yet, yesterday, I was treated like a trespasser." Andrew opened his mouth to respond, but Camille wasn't finished. "I've spent decades building relationships with artists, curators, and historians, preserving works that would otherwise be lost to private vaults or destroyed by neglect. You speak of integrity? Your auction house couldn't exist without people like me." Andrew's polished exterior began to crack, his confidence faltering. "Ms. Johnson," he said, his voice quieter now, "I apologize if there was a misunderstanding. That was never our intention." "Your intentions are irrelevant," Camille replied coldly. "Your actions were clear." The door opened, and Oliver entered, looking slightly frazzled. He froze when he saw Camille. "Oh, Ms. Johnson, I wasn't expecting to see you this morning," he said quickly. "Is everything all right?" "Not yet," Camille said, her tone softening slightly as she glanced at him. "But perhaps you can help." Oliver glanced nervously at Andrew, then back at Camille. "Of course. What can I do?" "You can ensure that I'm properly registered for the auction," she said. "And you can explain to Mr. Andrew here why it's in Hathaway and Company's best interest to treat all their guests with respect." Oliver nodded quickly, his hands gripping his clipboard. "Absolutely. I'll take care of it personally." Camille stood, adjusting her scarf. "Good. I'll be back this evening." As she walked past Andrew, she paused briefly, meeting his gaze. "The art world thrives on connections, Mr. Andrew. It would serve you well to remember that next time." Without waiting for a response, she exited the room, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Outside, the crisp autumn air filled her lungs as she descended the steps. She felt a small measure of satisfaction, but the fire in her chest remained. This wasn't over. As she reached her car, her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't David. It was a number she recognized all too well, Victor St. Clair. She stared at the screen, her jaw tightening. After a moment's hesitation, she answered. "Victor," she said curtly. "Camille," his voice drawled, smooth and insincere. "I hear you're planning to bid on the Golden Muse. I hope you've come prepared." Her grip on the phone tightened. "You should hope the same." Victor chuckled softly. "Let the best collector win." The line went dead. Camille stood frozen for a moment, the rivalry reignited in her chest. Tonight would not just be about the painting, it would be about proving once and for all who truly belonged. The auction hall was a symphony of anticipation. The stage, framed by velvet curtains, showcased the centerpiece of the evening, the Golden Muse. The painting, luminous even under subdued lighting, seemed to radiate its historical significance. Camille sat in the back row, her usual quiet elegance drawing little attention. She preferred it that way, especially now with Victor St. Clair perched in the front row like a king surveying his court. Victor's smug confidence was palpable, his every movement deliberate, as if he knew the room belonged to him. The chatter in the hall quieted as the auctioneer stepped to the podium, his hammer gleaming under the spotlight. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice crisp and authoritative, "thank you for joining us tonight. Our first piece, a 17th century sculpture, comes from a private estate inn." Camille tuned out the opening items, her focus locked on the painting. Each second brought her closer to the pivotal moment when the Golden Muse would be up for bidding. Her calm facade masked the simmering tension within. This was more than an acquisition. It was about proving her presence in a space that had tried to erase her. Midway through the auction, Oliver approached her, leaning down to whisper. "Ms. Johnson," he said softly, "I've registered you as bidder number 42. You'll be able to participate without any issues." "Thank you, Oliver." Camille's tone was polite but distant. He lingered for a moment, hesitant. "For what it's worth, I hope you win tonight. That painting belongs with someone who truly values it." She glanced at him, her gaze softening. "It does, and I will." As Oliver stepped away, Camille's phone vibrated in her pocket. A message from David appeared on the screen. "Be careful. Victor knows how to push buttons. Don't let him bait you." Camille slid the phone back into her pocket. She knew Victor's tactics well. His charm was a thin veneer for the ruthless competitor beneath. Finally, the auctioneer's voice rang out. And now, the piece de resistance of the evening. The Golden Muse, an exquisite 15th century work by an unknown artist, revered for its unique use of gold leaf and its enigmatic subject. Bidding will begin at $5 million. A murmur rippled through the room as assistants moved the painting into view. Camille straightened in her seat, her eyes locking onto the canvas. "Do I hear 5.5? The auctioneer called. Victor raised his paddle immediately, barely waiting for the starting bid to settle. 6 million? A paddle shot up across the room, followed by another. The bidding escalated quickly, with Victor countering each new offer effortlessly. His casual manner projected dominance, a message to the room that he was in control. Camille waited. She had learned patience in a world that demanded her to prove herself twice over, and tonight would be no different. 7 million, the auctioneer said. Camille raised her paddle, her movements calm but deliberate. A few heads turned, surprised by the new bidder entering the fray. Victor's head tilted slightly, as though he recognized her for the first time. A slow smile spread across his face. He raised his paddle. 8 million, the auctioneer said, barely acknowledging Camille's bid before turning to Victor. 9, she said, her voice steady. Victor leaned back in his seat, glancing over his shoulder at her. Camille, he called, his voice dripping with mock surprise. What a pleasure to see you here. Several people turned to look at her now, their curiosity piqued. Camille remained impassive, her gaze fixed on the auctioneer. 10 million, Victor said, returning his attention to the podium. The room buzzed with whispers as the bidding reached a fever pitch. Camille raised her paddle without hesitation. 11, Victor chuckled, shaking his head slightly. You're full of surprises tonight. 12 million, the auctioneer prompted. Victor raised his paddle lazily, as though the amount were inconsequential. 12, Camille didn't waver. 13, Victor turned fully in his seat now, addressing her directly. Camille, I'm curious. What exactly do you plan to do with it? Another museum donation? Or will it disappear into one of your famous vaults? She met his gaze coolly, her expression unreadable. I plan to preserve it. Something you've never cared much about. A ripple of laughter passed through the audience, subdued but noticeable. Victor's smile tightened. 14 million, he said sharply, his tone losing its earlier nonchalance. Camille paused. The tension in the room was palpable now, the audience captivated by the unfolding battle. Finally, she raised her paddle. 15, the auctioneer's voice grew louder, his excitement evident. 15 million. Do I hear 16? Victor's jaw clenched. He raised his paddle, but the movement lacked the arrogance of before. 16. Camille didn't hesitate. 17. A hush fell over the room. Even the auctioneer seemed momentarily stunned by the rapid escalation. Victor turned fully in his chair, his composure cracking. You're out of your depth, Camille, he said, his voice low but audible to those nearby. She leaned forward slightly, her tone icy but controlled. And yet here you are, threatened by someone you think doesn't belong. Victor's eyes narrowed. For the first time that evening, the veneer of superiority slipped, replaced by a flicker of genuine irritation. 18 million, he snapped, raising his paddle with a force that seemed almost desperate. Camille hesitated, her gaze locked on the painting. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing against her. This wasn't just about winning. It was about the principle, about reclaiming space that others had tried to deny her. 18 million going once, the auctioneer said. Going twice. Camille's hand remained still. She glanced at Victor, whose triumphant smirk had returned. Sold. The sound of the hammer falling echoed through the hall, sealing Victor's victory. The audience erupted into applause as Victor leaned back, basking in the glow of his triumph. Camille's expression remained unreadable as she stood, gathering her belongings. As she exited the hall, she felt Victor's gaze follow her. Outside, the cold air hit her like a slap. She paused on the steps, exhaling slowly. Her phone buzzed again. David's message was waiting. "Did you get it?" Camille typed back, "No, but it's not over." And it wasn't. She had lost the battle, but the war was far from finished. Victor St. Clair sat in the private lounge of Hathaway and Company, a glass of scotch in his hand and his smug grin firmly in place. His entourage buzzed around him, congratulating him on his masterful win of the Golden Muse. "You should have seen her face," Victor said, laughing. "Camille thought she could outbid me. I mean, honestly, did she think she had the resources to compete with me?" His companions chuckled in agreement, their laughter filling the space. Outside, in the dimly lit corridor, Camille leaned against the wall, her arms crossed. She had no interest in engaging Victor here. There were better ways to play this game. As she turned to leave, Oliver approached her, his expression nervous. "Ms. Johnson," he began, lowering his voice, "I think you should know something." She raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "Victor, he didn't bid on the Golden Muse just to have it," Oliver admitted, shifting uncomfortably. "He wanted to keep it away from you. He told me as much earlier tonight." Camille's jaw tightened, though her face remained composed. "Did he now?" Oliver nodded quickly. "He's having it delivered to his estate by morning. But I overheard something else, something that might interest you." Her eyes narrowed slightly, her curiosity piqued. "I'm listening." "Victor doesn't plan to preserve the painting," Oliver said, his voice low. "He's been working with a private broker to liquidate parts of his collection. It seems he's not as solvent as he lets on." Camille's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "So, the great Victor St. Clair is overleveraged." Oliver glanced around nervously. "I shouldn't have said anything, but I thought you deserved to know." "You did the right thing," she said, her tone firm. "And don't worry, this stays between us." As Oliver nodded and hurried off, Camille stood still for a moment, her mind racing. Victor's arrogance had finally overreached. If what Oliver said was true, then the Golden Muse wasn't as secure as Victor would like the world to believe. The next day, Camille sat in her study, her collection of masterpieces lining the walls like silent witnesses to her brilliance. Her assistant, Naomi, entered with a tablet in hand. "I've done some digging, per your request," Naomi said, setting the device in front of Camille. "Victor's financial situation isn't great. He's been quietly selling off assets to cover mounting debts. If I had to guess, the Golden Muse will be on the market within weeks." Camille nodded slowly, absorbing the information. "Good. That gives us time." Naomi hesitated before adding, "But there's more. I found a connection between Victor and one of Hathaway's senior staff, Andrew. He's been feeding Victor insider information about competing bidders." Camille's expression darkened, though her voice remained calm. "So that's how Victor knew I'd be there." Naomi nodded. "It seems so. Do you want me to report them?" "Not yet," Camille replied, her tone measured. "Let them think they've won for now. We'll strike when the time is right." Naomi smiled faintly. "I'll keep digging." As her assistant left, Camille stared at the Golden Muse on her tablet screen. The painting's golden hues seemed to shimmer, as if daring her to act. She reached for her phone and dialed David. "It's me," she said when he answered. "I've been waiting for this call," David replied. "What's the plan?" "We're going to make Victor regret underestimating me," Camille said, her voice steady. "But I'll need your help." "Anything," David said without hesitation. "I want you to reach out to your contacts, private brokers, appraisers, anyone who deals in high-value transactions. Let them know I'm interested in acquiring the Golden Muse." Discreetly, of course. David hesitated. "You think Victor will sell?" "He won't have a choice," Camille replied, her confidence unshakable. A week later, the art world was abuzz with rumors. Whispers of Victor's financial troubles had begun to spread, though no one dared to address them outright. Camille, meanwhile, remained silent, letting the situation unfold. One evening, as she sat in her gallery, her phone rang. The number was unknown, but she answered it anyway. "Ms. Johnson," a smooth voice said on the other end. "This is Armand Duval, a broker representing a private seller. I believe you expressed interest in the Golden Muse?" Camille's lips twitched into a small smile. "I might have." "Well," Armand continued, "the piece has recently become available. My client is looking for a buyer who appreciates its significance." "And what's the asking price?" Armand hesitated, then named a figure. It was significantly lower than Victor had paid at auction, a sign of his desperation. "Interesting," Camille said, keeping her tone neutral. "I'll need to inspect the piece before making a decision." "Of course," Armand replied. "Shall we arrange a private viewing?" Camille agreed, setting the time and place. As she ended the call, she leaned back in her chair, a sense of satisfaction washing over her. Victor had played his hand too recklessly, and now the masterpiece was within her grasp. The viewing was held at a discreet location, a luxurious penthouse in the city. Camille arrived dressed in her usual understated elegance, her composure as sharp as ever. Armand greeted her warmly, leading her to a room where the Golden Muse was displayed under soft lighting. "It's even more beautiful in person," Armand said, gesturing toward the painting. Camille stepped closer, her eyes scanning every detail. The gold leaf shimmered under the light, the delicate brushstrokes a testament to its creator's skill. She took her time, letting the silence stretch. Finally, she turned to Armand. "Tell your client I'll take it. Full payment upon delivery." Armand nodded, clearly pleased. "A pleasure doing business with you, Ms. Johnson." As she left the penthouse, Camille allowed herself a rare smile. The painting was hers at last, but more importantly, Victor's arrogance had been his undoing. That evening, as Victor sat in his study, a notification appeared on his phone. His broker had confirmed the sale of the Golden Muse. He leaned back, trying to ignore the bitter taste of defeat. Across the city, Camille stood in her gallery, the painting newly installed in its rightful place. She stared at it for a long moment before turning to Naomi, who stood nearby. "Do you think he knows yet?" Naomi asked. Camille smiled faintly. "Oh, he'll know, and he'll never forget." Victor paced the marble floor of his sprawling estate, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. "What do you mean it's sold?" he barked at his broker. "I gave you explicit instructions to vet the buyer." "I understand, Mr. St. Clair," the broker stammered. "But the offer came quickly, and you said—" "I know what I said." Victor snapped. He ended the call abruptly and slammed the phone onto the nearest surface. A familiar dread was creeping in, the realization that he had overplayed his hand. He poured himself a drink, the clink of ice against glass the only sound in the room. As he sank into a leather armchair, his thoughts churned. Camille's name loomed in his mind like a shadow. Could it be her? He had no proof, but the nagging feeling refused to leave him. Across the city, Camille stood in the center of a grand gallery, the soft hum of voices echoing around her. The event was intimate, attended by collectors, curators, and emerging artists whose work adorned the walls. The Golden Muse occupied the central display, its luminous beauty drawing admiration from everyone who passed. David approached her with a glass of wine, his expression one of pride. "You've outdone yourself, Camille." "It's not about me," she replied, her gaze fixed on the painting. "It's about the art, and the people who create it." David smiled knowingly. "Still, I'd love to see Victor's face when he realizes what you've done." Camille turned to him, her lips curving into a faint smile. Victor's ego has always been his weakness. This was never about him. She gestured toward the artists mingling nearby, diverse, passionate, and full of potential. This is what matters, giving these voices a platform, preserving the stories that others overlook. As the evening progressed, Camille gave a short speech, her voice carrying the calm authority that had come to define her. "Art is more than a commodity," she said, addressing the room. "It's a reflection of our humanity. It connects us across time, across cultures, across divides that others would have us believe are insurmountable. The Golden Muse is not mine. It belongs to everyone who finds inspiration in its story. And that's why it's here tonight." not hidden in a vault but shared with the world. The applause was warm, genuine, and Camille allowed herself a moment to absorb the energy of the room. 2 days later, Victor received an invitation. The envelope was unmarked, its contents simple: a ticket to Camille's gallery exhibit. At first he scoffed, tossing it aside, but curiosity gnawed at him. Hours later, he found himself walking into the gallery under the cover of night, determined to see for himself what Camille had orchestrated. The room was empty save for the security staff, who barely glanced at him as he entered. The soft glow of the lights illuminated the golden muse, now framed with a plaque that read, "On loan from the private collection of Camille Johnson." Victor froze, his breath catching in his chest. For a moment, all his bravado crumbled. She had bested him, not just financially, but morally. By placing the painting on display, Camille had done what he never could. She had made the art itself the priority. As he turned to leave, he noticed Camille standing in the shadows, her arms crossed. "I wondered if you'd show up," she said, her tone neutral. Victor approached her slowly, his usual arrogance tempered by the weight of the moment. "You always were unpredictable, Camille." She tilted her head slightly. "And you were always predictable, Victor." He chuckled bitterly. "You planned this, didn't you? From the moment I won the auction." Camille's gaze was steady. "No, Victor. You planned this the moment you let your ego guide you. I simply adapted." He sighed, shaking his head. "I underestimated you." "You've been underestimating people your entire life," she replied. "It's why you're losing." Victor's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he gestured toward the painting. "So what now? Another exhibit? A museum loan?" Camille's lips curved into a faint smile. "Now, I focus on the future, on supporting the artists who will shape it." He regarded her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "For what it's worth," he said finally, "you're better at this than I am." She raised an eyebrow. "I know." Victor laughed softly, though there was no malice in it. "Good luck, Camille. Not that you need it." As he exited the gallery, Camille watched him go, a quiet sense of closure settling over her. Months later, the Camille Johnson Foundation was officially launched. Its mission was simple: to democratize access to art and elevate underrepresented voices. Camille poured her resources into the foundation, ensuring that emerging artists had the opportunities she herself had fought so hard to create. The Golden Muse became a symbol of the foundation's ethos, a reminder that art was meant to be shared, to inspire, to connect. Standing in the foundation's new gallery space, Camille looked out at a group of young artists preparing for their first exhibit. Naomi approached her, a smile on her face. "It's quite the legacy you're building," Naomi said. Camille nodded, her gaze softening. "It's not about legacy. It's about leaving the world better than I found it." And with that, Camille turned back to the gallery, ready to embrace the next chapter.